Beacon Press Audio presents Dangerous Ideas, A Brief History of Censorship in the West, From the Ancients to Fake News, by Eric Berkowitz. This audiobook is narrated by Tim Campbell. Published by Beacon Press Audio, 2021. Introduction. During the Chinese fever dream known as the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 76, Mao Zedong's Red Guards marauded through the country, destroying the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. Central to that campaign was the annihilation of ancient religion, leading to the destruction of millions of books, images, and objects related to Confucius and Tibetan Buddhism. Scholars of the ancient philosopher were deemed reactionary and tortured as Confucian texts and statues were extirpated. Buddhist monks were forced to trample their books and use what remained as toilet paper, and Tibet's holiest temple was repurposed as a place to keep and slaughter pigs. Secular schools and universities were also closed, their books destroyed, again by the millions, as poisonous weeds. Red Guards invaded homes to destroy family photographs, feudal relics, and replace them with images of Mao, before which citizens were required to confess their sins. Yet even as Mao eliminated China's backward elements to make himself the beginning, middle, and end of Chinese thought, he publicly aligned himself with the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, 259 to 210 BCE, who also burned books and used violence to unify the region's 7 major states and create the centralized kingdom that became China. Despite his considerable achievements, the first emperor was disliked, to say the least. As long as people's thoughts remained out of his control, he knew his power was not entirely secure. As he traveled the empire, he seethed upon hearing of Confucian and other scholars who compared his regime unfavorably to the golden ages of the past. He decided to immolate that past. The events referred to as the burning of the books and the burying of the philosophers took place in 213 and 12 BCE, when countless poetry, history, and philosophy texts, mostly silk rolls and bamboo and wooden tablets, were destroyed, particularly Confucian texts and those of the so-called 100 schools of thought. Most private book ownership became forbidden. Qin kept copies of the books he burned, but those who knew the texts best were not spared. Hundreds of scholars were buried alive. From that point forward, anyone who criticized Qin's regime with examples from the past, or even discussed the ideas in the banned books, was executed, along with their relatives. Like most political censorship throughout history, observes the scholar Lois Mai Chan, Qin's book burning proved to be, rather than a condemnation, a recognition of the power of knowledge. For Qin, security meant dominance not only of the wheels of state, but also of the ideas darting through the minds of the governed. Intellectuals, in particular, were empowered by the forbidden books, which bred seditious thoughts that challenged the first emperor's absolute rule. As the 20th century Chinese writer Lu Xun observed, the statesman hates the writer because the writer sows the seeds of dissent. What the statesman dreams of is to be able to prevent people from thinking, and thus he always accuses the artists and writers of upsetting his orderly state. Soon enough, however, Qin's paranoia brought him to the same end that he had meted out to his critics. As assassination attempts increased in frequency, he spent his days in tunnels with a sword on his lap, and became consumed with forestalling death. Just 3 years after he burned the books, according to legend, he drank what he hoped was an elixir of immortality, and died. He was buried with a massive terracotta army to protect him in the afterlife. But the Qin dynasty, from which China derives its name, fell into chaos and collapsed. Mao found much in Qin to emulate, except the first emperor had not gone far enough. In 1958, 9 years before the Cultural Revolution, Mao bragged in a speech, "Qin buried 460 scholars alive. We have buried 46,000 scholars alive. You intellectuals revile us for being Qin Shi Huangs. You are wrong. We have surpassed Qin Shi Huang 100-fold. When Mao died in 1976, it was said that the glow of his thought would shine into future generations. Yet, despite the crowds who visit his mausoleum and the presence of his image on Chinese currency, Maoism is as vital today as Chin's clay soldiers. Apart from Pol Pot's Cambodia, where the ability to read could be a capital offense, no modern society has so pillaged its own culture and history as China during the Cultural Revolution. But while the scale of the devastation was unique, the impulse behind it was not. When a regime's power rests on force rather than consent, its legitimacy requires constant manhandling of the past, in effect making history an instrument of ideology and power. In China, as in the totalitarian superstate described in George Orwell's 1984, history was a palimpsest, to be scraped clean and reinscribed as often as necessary. In any such system, Orwell wrote elsewhere, history is to be created rather than learned. History has always been a form of practical literature, useful for sanctifying institutions and providing people with a sense of destiny. But for authoritarians, history is a matter of urgent necessity, to make their presence appear inevitable and welcome, to legitimate their actions and to undermine their adversaries. Warring authorities, explains the historian J. H. Plum, mean warring pasts. This is why totalitarian regimes give historians no freedom, why Donald Trump vehemently denied irregularities in his election and advanced a false contrary narrative, and why the 16th century Spanish invaders in Mesoamerica destroyed the Maya civilization's most sacred and ancient texts. It also explains why the Guatemalan government targeted the Maya for renewed cultural extermination during that country's 1960-96 civil war. For the sin of supporting anti-government elements, Mayan elders who were responsible for transmitting accumulated cultural knowledge to younger generations were murdered with exceptional cruelty in order to destroy the people's links with their past, according to one investigation. It has been said that any old man who dies is a burning library. Indeed, one of the more odious forms of censorship is the destruction of the people and texts that give a culture cohesion and collective memory. However, the past can also be forcibly curated in the service of truth, as attested by multiple laws across the West criminalizing Holocaust denial. These rules are meant, among other things, to quell the vicious claim that Jews use a genocide myth to extort money from Christian nations. By guarding the factuality of the Holocaust, lawmakers hope to prevent a hideous form of hate speech and the violent extremism that is nourished by it. What could be wrong with that? Quite a bit, it turns out, because even such well-intentioned censorship is not readily squared with a commitment to freedom of speech and inquiry, at least not in the context of American and Canadian law. In 1985, one Ernst Zündel was put on trial in Canada for publishing a pamphlet called Did 6 Million Really Die?, which claimed the Holocaust was a Zionist hoax. Canada didn't have a specific Holocaust denial law, and he was charged under a statute criminalizing the publication of false news causing injury or mischief to the public interest. Zündel arrived at the courthouse each day wearing a hard hat emblazoned with the words freedom of speech. Not wanting to shortcut the prosecution's duty to prove guilt, the court required the state to demonstrate that the Holocaust had in fact occurred, and allowed rebuttal evidence that it had not, exactly what Zündel hoped for. During the lengthy circus-like trial, he and his experts spewed the same calumnies that were in the pamphlet, but on a bigger, more legitimate platform than he had ever enjoyed. Newspapers featured headlines such as, "Women dined and danced at Auschwitz, expert witness says." Zündel was found guilty, but the conviction was thrown out on appeal, in part because a documentary film used as evidence of the death camp's reality was rejected as hearsay. Zündel was tried and convicted again in 1988, but this time he won a much bigger victory on appeal. The Supreme Court of Canada held that the law against spreading false news unconstitutionally abridged speech. The law's vague prohibitions could have totalitarian effects, the court held, because it allowed convictions for virtually any statement which does not accord with currently accepted truths, and could be used to permit the prosecution of unpopular ideas. To freeze history into one acceptable narrative, the court reasoned, would repeat the errors of the Nazi and communist regimes, as well.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?